Okay. We're going to talk about the writing of the 12 and 12, the history of the 12 and 12. My name is Jim Worley, and I'm an alcoholic. My sobriety date is March 5th, 1989. My home group is the First Things First group in Cancun, Mexico. So,
Hi, Jim.
we're going to talk first about why did Bill write the 12 and 12? I have about 7 main reasons why Bill wrote the 12 and 12. Number one, the period from 1935 to 1935 is called the flying blind period. They did a lot of trial and error. They didn't really know what they were doing. They had a lot of failure, but they found some things that worked. That's called the flying blind period from 1935 to 1939. And then the big book was published in 1939. Now, the period of 1939, when the book was published, the big book, until 1950, was another flying blind period. First, we had to learn how to get sober. So this is just how AA grew. If you look at in the yellow there, in April of 1939, when the big book was published, on the right-hand side, it says there were about 4,650 members. 4,650 books were published. I'm sorry. There were 4 groups and only about 100 members. Now, if you go down to the yellow where it says February of 1950, there were now 50,000 books being published. There were 3,527 groups and almost 100,000 members. So if you have 100 members, things are different from when you have 100,000 members. They asked Bill, they said, how does AA work? And he said, well, I cannot fully answer that question. Many techniques have been adopted after a 10-year period of trial and error that have led to interesting results. We can only tell you what we do, what happens, and what works. Then Bill we found little by little, Bill says, that the groups had to have work done. There had to be a chairman and someone had to elect him. And then there were troubles, and then there was a lot of fear. The first period of flying blind had to do with whether an individual can be restored into one piece, whether we can stay sober, whether the forces of destruction inside him could be contained and subdued. Now we were beginning to wonder in the early part of our adolescence whether the destructive forces in our groups would rend us apart and destroy our society. Reason number 2 is people asked Bill to write. So for several years, members of AA and many other non-alcoholic friends urged Bill to prepare one book on the 12 traditions and the 12 steps that included his interpretation of the group structure and principles of AA. So in 1952, Bill reported to the conference that he was working on such a project. And that was number 2. People asked him to. Number 3, one motive impelling Wilson to write the 12 traditions and 12 steps had been the realization that the original text of the big book had become frozen, too sacred for even him to change. And he didn't like that. There were some things he wanted to change. Yet because of the success of the original edition of the big book, Bill was virtually all others were wary. They didn't want to change. Sorry. The modification in one of the early printings that substituted spiritual awakening for spiritual experience in the 12th step was made more consistent. The second printing of the big book, it was changed from spiritual experience to spiritual awakening. And some of the people liked it and some of the people didn't. Bill didn't particularly like it, but he changed it. Bill was well aware of the enshrinement of the text of the big book, and he was not particularly happy. He felt strongly that the program had become frozen by the membership, and it was the primary reason why he wrote the 12 steps and 12 traditions. He was frustrated by that frozen state of the literature. He wanted to be able to change it as A.A. grew. But he found out he couldn't do that. He said in 1952, he says, as to changing the steps or the text of the A.A. book, I'm assured by many that I could certainly be excommunicated if a word were touched. Reasons number 4 and number 5 why he wrote. Bill had been writing a lot in the grapevine for years, not to mention his personal and A.A.-related correspondence. Other writers like Ed Webster, Richmond Walker, Father Fow, and others who wrote the Akron Manual and Tablemate, they were putting out a lot of pamphlets published by individual groups, and all this was being done without any control or of what was being written. In 1951, the board of A.A., following Dr. Bob's death, voted to give Bill, change Bill's royalty on the big book sales from 10% to 15%. So anything he would write from now on, any books, he would be paid 15% commission on royalty. And in 1951, the conference, the very first conference, recommended that in future years, A.A. textbook literature should have conference approval. Reason number 6 was very personal. As he did with the big book, Bill was writing about his personal experiences. Bill said, being nearly all exposition, it's rather pedestrian. He said it was very dull. He thought it was very dull. And he says, I now understand why. I think I was trying to write a prescription for myself. The tradition part, nearly all it heavily deflationary. To me, I think I have accepted it. But when it comes to the deeper implication to the 12 steps, well, that's something else again. Also, he wanted to change. Bill was, during the 1940s, he was seeing one psychiatrist, Harry Tiebout, and then later a lady Jungian psychologist, Frances Wicks. And he continued his treatment, his psychology with the psychologist, at least until 1949. And Bill says, it may be that someday we shall devise some common denominator of psychiatry, which neurotics could use on each other. The idea would be to extend the moral inventory of A.A. to a deeper level, making it an inventory of psychic damages. I suppose someday a Neurotics Anonymous will be formed and will actually do this. Of course, there is a Neurotics Anonymous now. Bill also said that he wanted an inventory of psychic damages, actual episodes, inferiority, shame, guilt, anger, and to relive them in our minds. So there were some things that he wanted to change, and it became, in the big book, it was more about a religious conversion, a surrender. But in the 12 and 12, because of his experience with psychiatrists, it was a little bit more of a psychoanalytical view. Bill had changed. He had new experiences, and he wanted to share those experiences with us. And the last reason is he wanted to use the 12 and 12 as bait. You know, when you go fishing, and you have bait to attract the other fish. Well, on May 20th, 1952, Bill wrote to Father Dowling, and he sent him a draft copy of the 12 essays on the traditions. And Bill said in the quotes there, a few people think that the traditions aren't covered with enough dignity, that posterity may not like them for that reason. However, we feel that we're writing for the information of alcoholics who ordinarily have no time to read anything much except as it concerns their own personal survival. Our idea is to publish the 12 steps. We're all interested in ourselves and how we work, how we stay sober in the steps, and the 12 traditions in a small book. He says, if we're able to do a fair job on the steps, that will be helpful and published along with the traditions. They may act as bait for reading the latter. Bill said, "We alcoholics are selfish. If it has to do with the steps and staying sober, we're interested." But most of the people at that time didn't want the traditions. They didn't like them. They didn't see why. So he wanted to write this about the steps in the same book so that they would read the traditions too. So the process of the steps during the writing of the 12 and 12. This is from the book Pass It On. First, there was the writing of 12 steps and 12 traditions. Bill had been planning to produce this book for each step and one for each tradition. These essays would expand, expound, and explain the meaning and application of each principle. Whereas the big book, written in 1938, radiates Bill's joy and gratitude at having finally found a way to stay sober, the 12 and 12 reflects an entirely different mood. By 1951 and 52, Bill wrote the second book. He was suffering from almost constant depression and was forced to confront the emotional and spiritual demons that remain stranded in the alcoholic psyche when the high tide of active alcoholism recedes. Once we get sober, Bill found out, not all of our problems go away. Some of our problems are still with us from childhood trauma, from what we have learned and what we suffer. We stop drinking, but there are still other problems in our life. And he had met a lot of other people in AA who stayed sober, but there were still unproductive and often negative attitudes and traits that are frequently part of the disease of alcoholism. The 12 and 12 discusses some of these problems that aren't even mentioned in the big book. As to God for existence, the big book says, when we drew near to him, he disclosed himself to us. Well, the 12 and 12 says, sometimes the hand of God seems heavy or even unjust. And that sometimes we go through times when we can pray only with the greatest exertion of will. Occasionally we go even further. We're seized by rebellion. Just because we stop drinking doesn't mean all of our problems go away. So Bill wanted to talk about those. And so he had been on the mountaintop and he had his spiritual experience, but he also realized that life sometimes brings us other problems that we have to deal with and that there are challenges ahead. And he wanted to talk about those challenges and how we deal with those problems in sobriety. He started writing as soon as the General Service Conference in 1951. The traditions essays came first. Actually, he had started writing in 1945 about in the Grapevine, and he called them the 12 points to assure our future. And he wrote a lot about the traditions from that starting in 1945. In a letter to Father Dowling, he said, the problem of the steps has been to broaden and deepen them both for newcomers and old timers. But the angles are so many, it's hard to shoot them rightly. We have to deal now. Now, this wasn't in the beginning with only 100 people in the beginning when he wrote the big book, but now we have 100,000 people. And he says, and we have to deal with atheists, agnostics, believers, depressives, paranoids, clergymen, psychiatrists, and all kinds of people. Yeah. And there were other efforts to explain, interpret, and expand and teach the 12 steps during the 1940s. The first AA pamphlet that was published by the Alcoholic Foundation in 1940 was based on some articles written in the Houston newspaper by Larry Jewell. And it talked about what AA is and about the 12 steps. That was in 1940. The people in Akron and Dr. Bob didn't think that the big book was good for common people. And so they wrote a series of pamphlets in Akron and that they used to help people to stay sober and learn about the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. The most famous one, of course, is called the Manual for Alcoholics Anonymous. A lot of very practical steps about getting sober, staying sober, and as an introduction to Alcoholics Anonymous. They also had a pamphlet called A Guide to the 12 Steps that taught what the steps were and what they were about to newcomers. This was in the very early 1940s. Then there was another pamphlet called The Table Mate, which is still on sale in some intergroup offices. The Table Mate was a set of beginners lessons. Many groups had beginners meetings and beginners lessons, and they would break them down into four different weeks. The first week, we're going to discuss the admission, step number 1. Week number 2, we'll talk about spirituality. Number 3, inventory and restitution. And the 4th week, we talk about active work. So these were classes for beginners. And different groups made these up. Many of them used this Table Mate pamphlet, many towns and cities. Then the man, Richmond Walker, who wrote the 24-hour-a-day book, meditation book, wrote a book called For Drunks Only that also explained about the 12 steps, and it was an introduction to Alcoholics Anonymous and how to work the 12 steps, to live the 12 steps, and how to stay sober. And then, of course, in December of 1945 in Minnesota, they had beginners meetings too. They had the 4 one-hour classes, and they had new members were urged to attend all the sessions in order. And they had objectives, and this is these are the people there in Minnesota: Barry C. on the left, and on the right, Ed Webster, who wrote the Little Red Book. They had their beginner classes, and no one really taught the classes the same way. Each group, had a different way of teaching these classes, and they were taught based on the group conscience. And they even said, well, we know that some people are going to drop out of AA. They said, we anticipate on losing some AA hangers-on in the elimination automatically imposed by the rule that these classes must be attended. So they had rules then in AA. You have to go to these classes or you can't belong to AA. And so the classes were actually printed and formalized and printed in what's called the Little Red Book in 1946. And it says the material in the Little Red Book is an outgrowth of a series of notes for 12-step instruction to AA beginners. So it became, the big book was a big red book, and this one was printed and it was a little book. So it was called the Little Red Book. And this was also, the manuscript for this book was sent to Dr. Bob, and he approved this book. And he had the office make it available to anyone who wanted it. So Dr. Bob liked this book too. So the problem was that there was an increasing number of books and pamphlets, and they were all speaking for AA, and they were all different, and people used them differently. So the Little Red Book was receiving a lot of attention, and then they decided that there should be some control over what was printed by AA. And these people, Ed Webster, and they had sent these little books to places like London and Canada, and so they were kind of speaking for AA. And Bill wasn't real happy about that just anybody could speak for AA. In November of 1950, Bill wrote to Barry Collins about the Little Red Book, and excuse me, and he said the Little Red Book does fill a definite need and has wide circulation. Therefore, its usefulness is unquestioned. AA has a definite place for such a book. So Bill was being nice. Someday I may try to write an introduction book myself, which I hope might complement favorably the Little Red Book. He says, here at the foundation, we are not policemen. We're a service, and A.A.s are free to read anything that they choose. But just a few months later, Bill had a surprise for Ed Webster, who wrote the Little Red Book. He told Ed, he said, I'm also working on a small book, talking about the 12 and 12, now almost complete. And 12 pieces on the A.A. traditions that are in the grapevine, and working on essays on the 12 steps. And they're intended to deepen the understanding of both steps and traditions. So he's warning Ed, I'm writing a book too. So why did Bill write the 12 steps again? The 12 Steps and 12 Traditions, the book was published in 1953, 14 years after the Big Book. The need for a second book was first strongly felt by Bill and other alcoholics. When the first book came out, Bill had only 4.5 years of sobriety. Dr. Bob had 4, and most others in the young fellowship had considerably less time. Not drinking was a totally new experience, and the book understandably concentrated on that, the Big Book. However, as the years rolled on and some began to accumulate double-digit sobriety, they discovered that by itself, abstinence from alcohol was just not enough. The dry drunk syndrome was becoming all too obvious. One could be sober and still miserable and lead less than satisfactory lives. Bill himself was a prime example of this. His sobriety had been undermined by more than a decade of unrelenting depression and other problems, but he also shared the experiences of other A.A.s. The steps portion of the 12 and 12 was written to address those questions and those problems. The traditions was written to address the related question, which had arisen as 100 men and women of 1939 had grown to tens of thousands, 100,000 by 1953. Could such a large and disparate group continue to work together to help each other stay sober and achieve the goals of full recovery? The foreword to the 12 and 12 says, this startling expansion or growth brought with it a very severe growing pains. Proof that alcoholics could recover had been made. We can recover. We can stay sober. But it was by no means sure that great numbers of yet erratic people could live and work together with harmony and good effect. Everywhere there arose threatening questions of membership, money, personal relations, public relations, management of the groups, clubs, and lots of other problems. So as A.A. grows and its population changes, Bill, now with 18 years of sobriety instead of 4, feels the need to reinterpret the 12 steps in a way that is responsive to the new membership of A.A. I don't know if anyone here has studied statistics, but the statistics of 100 people, a book based on statistics based on 100 people, is not nearly as valid as a book based on, or statistics based on 100,000 people. So now there were all kinds of people in AA, and Bill wanted to reinterpret the steps for all of these people. In the beginning, Bill said we dealt with low bottom cases only, people on the streets and in hospitals and asylums. Now composed of a growing number of alcoholics who still had their health, families, and jobs. So people weren't drunk and homeless anymore. They were people that still had jobs and families and homes. So this was different. And besides that, in order to address the needs of this new population, Bill widens the hoop that members have to jump through in order to feel they're actively working the program. He accomplishes this primarily by introducing the method of substitution in his third step instructions and making major changes to the inventory process. In speaking of the trouble that many A.A.s have with turning their will and their life over to the care of God, Bill says, well, many people begin to solve the problem by a method of substitution. Instead of God, if you don't believe in God or a different concept, you can, if you wish, make A.A. itself your higher power. And many members have crossed the threshold, came in the door this way, and later most of them began to talk of God. Bill clearly expects that alcoholics who use A.A. as their higher power will eventually adopt a more spiritual outlook. So Bill's method of substitution makes it possible for A.A. members to feel that they're honestly working the steps without ever turning their lives over to the care of God, a God. Bill's new instructions for the fourth step are another significant development. The big book outlines an inventory process that sees selfishness, the root of the alcoholic's problem. In Bill's new version, however, the root of the alcoholic's problem is not selfishness, but rather instincts that are out of control. The newcomer has some other changes. You know, the newcomer has some assets which can be noted along with his liabilities. That's not in the big book. But we found out that we had some good things to talk about too. The new inventory is not meant to resemble a soul surgery like the Oxford group, in which the step worker identifies and carves out the defects of character that are blocking his or her soul from God. Rather, this inventory is an open-ended process of introspection and reflection. There is no promise of a life of freedom from selfishness or a new life of intimacy with spiritual power. Instead, recovering alcoholics should be content with gradual progress over a long period of time. This is more of the recovering alcoholic. This is a process. This is not something that instantly takes place. The sentiment that alcoholics should expect sobriety to be marked by long periods of struggle with their personal shortcomings is a reflection of Bill's own struggle with depression. His decreased expectations for the quality of his own sobriety lead him to lower his expectations for others as well. Inventory and recovery is a process that is more psychological in nature and the method of substitution, but it takes time. Step work is no longer insists on a spiritual experience as the answer to the problems of the alcoholic. It offers a solution that is social and psychological in nature. So some background on the steps. Bill says, I'm getting down to write some serious thinking and the problem of happy sobriety, not just being sober, not just not drinking, not just abstinence, but the problem of happy sobriety. And he said he's going to write also as a manual of AA services. So I'm beginning to get this all on paper. And he wrote this to Father Dowling, you know, that we read before, how to broaden and deepen the steps so that anybody can feel at home in AA. He told Father Ed in this letter that he wanted Father Ed to send him any criticisms. He sent him some rough drafts of the 12 and 12 and wanted Father Ed to send him any criticism that he had of the material, and explained that there were people that were helping him to edit the 12 and 12. Tom Powers, Betty Love, and Jack Alexander. Jack Alexander, who wrote the 1941 Saturday Evening Post article, were also taking a critical look at the chapters. He said that he had just finished the first drafts of the chapter on 2 of the 12 steps. So he was sending this like he did when he wrote the big book. He'd write a little and then he'd send it out to other people to see what they thought. Something else that's not mentioned in the big book much, and that's about pain and suffering. The word pain was likewise never given any positive meaning in the first part of the big book. in a story in the second edition, there's a story called The Professor and the Paradox. And it says, we A.A.s surrender to win, we give away to keep, we suffer to get well, and we die to live. And this was a changed attitude about the role of suffering, which Bill Wilson had developed through his work with Father Dowling. That sometimes there's pain and suffering in our life, whether it's the loss of a job or an illness or a loved one. There's pain and suffering in life, and Father Ed said, nor can men and women of A.A. ever forget that only through suffering did they find enough humility to enter the portals of that new world. How privileged we are to understand so well the divine paradox that strength comes out of weakness, that pain can be a beginning for all growth. Then there was a background on the traditions. And here's where it got rough in the particularly early and mid 1940s. Our little New York office began to be deluged with mail from these groups, growing up at distances and not in contact with our old centers, and they were having these troubles. There were people coming out of insane asylums. Lord, what would these lunatics do to us? There were prisoners. Would we be sandbagged? There were queer people. There were people, believe it or not, whose morals were bad. And the respectable alcoholics of that time shook their heads and said, surely these immoral people are going to tear us apart. There was Little Red Riding Hood and the bad wolves began, yes, could our society last? You know, that's what Bill, can it last with all these problems? Well, we sometimes congratulate ourselves. I was reading this recording of Bill, listening to it this morning. And Bill says, we sometimes congratulate ourselves on the traditions as though they were a list of virtues singular to us. Actually, they are codification of the lessons of our past experience during the early days of AA. These traditions are not fixed absolutely. There may be room for improvement. However, they should not be lightly cast aside, since they bear on unity, survival, and growth under God's grace. It may be hard, but there is growth with all these problems. We are entering a new era of growth with vast forces tearing at the world. The problems and difficulties of the future may be greater than those we have already survived. Still, there is a love among us that passes all understanding, and that will sustain us through all the trials that lie ahead, no matter what happens. Bill says our recovery program was really complete. Okay, so we got sober now. Then came the test whether our growing groups could live and work together, whether the enormous explosive quality of the fellowship could find in our principles of recovery a sufficient containing element. Soon we came to realize little by little that we of Alcoholics Anonymous must hang together, or indeed we should hang separately. And in that sometimes frightening experience, the tradition of Alcoholics Anonymous was forged. And at Cleveland in 1950, it was confirmed by our membership as the traditional platform upon which our society intended to stand. No body of law was this tradition, a set of principles infused with the spirit of our 12 steps of recovery and enshrined in the heart of each of us. That would be our protection, we thought, from any blows with which the outside world would assail us, our protection from any temptations to which we might be subjected within. Well, Bill had this guy says Bill proved a master of dodging. When a definite difficulty of a group was thrown into his lap for a solution, his answer, people they went to him all the time with all their problems. And he always ignored the problem, but he would tell them a story about how some group far away met a similar issue. That set the person asking the question thinking, and in most cases, he solved the problem himself. The result was that Bill left us with a realization that he had tossed the ball right back to our pitcher, with a kindly hint that we play ball according to the A.A. rule book, and that seemed to work. So they would come and say, we have this problem. And he would say, well, this is how the group in Philadelphia handled a similar problem. He would tell them a story about another group's experience and how they had fixed it. A.A. historian William White says this about why A.A. survived. Because most historians believe that the traditions are very good for staying sober. But without the traditions, the steps were good for staying sober. But without the traditions, A.A. would disappear. So William White says the attributes of A.A. that gained the most attention about supporters and critics of A.A. are the 12 steps. But I have long argued that the key to A.A.'s vibrancy as an organization rests not with the steps, but with traditions. The traditions were A.A.'s response to the threats that fatally wounded A.A.'s predecessors and that could have destroyed A.A. When the larger cultural influence of A.A. is written in the centuries to come, these radical principles of organizational management may well be celebrated as a contribution even greater than A.A.'s framework of alcoholism recovery. A.A.'s 12 steps exist within a pre-existing tradition of alcoholism recovery movements. Excuse me. But the 12 traditions fueled a fundamentally new type of organization, one that broke all the prevailing rules about how organizations must be structured and managed. Just like the upside-down pyramid, it's not the General Service Board who runs AA. It's the groups. It's the groups who are at the top. So we'll do a backstory on the traditions and how they developed. As Bill, guided by his long experience, helped groups work out their problems, he saw certain principles evolving. He began to assemble them into the traditions. One example, there was a National Committee on Education on Alcoholism formed in 1944. This led to two traditions, specifically those of anonymity and non-affiliation. The founder was Marty. Marty Mann was a solid AA and a good friend of Bill's. Since the purpose of the committee was to educate the public about alcoholism, Bill and Bob both thought it would be all right for Marty, when she told her own story in public, to mention that she had reached sobriety through AA. They gave her permission to break her anonymity. Bill later said, boy, that was a bad decision that I made. Anyway, another situation was a rich AA member died and left $10,000 to the foundation in her will. And they needed money at the time. But then Bill remembered how the accumulation of too much money in group treasuries had caused arguments and disruption. Once or twice, a member or two had even gotten drunk as a result. Bill talked with Bob and many other members about it, then took the matter to the trustees. And so the amount that the $10,000 was turned down. They refused to accept the donation. And in fact, in history, AA sometimes has to hire lawyers to not accept money. People leave money in their will or when they die, and AA has to go to court to not accept the money. Bill often went to Akron to consult with Dr. Bob, whose practical viewpoint and deep spiritual insight were always helpful. And Dr. Bob agreed with Bill's analysis of the principles that evolved from the group experiences. And so finally, after much consultation with members, Bill set down on paper the resulting guides, AA's 12 traditions, what he originally called 12 points to assure our future. Another book that Bill read that he took information, another book that influenced Bill was Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America. Bill called Alcoholics Anonymous a pure democracy because all power rests in the individual members who are all equal, and a dictatorship because alcohol is the ultimate authority. In fact, the phrase from the concepts, the tyranny of the majority and the tyranny of the majority, are from that book. So Bill was getting information from all over. Nell Wing also said that I mentioned previously two other influences on Bill thinking about AA's structural concepts. One of these was St. Francis of Assisi. From him, Bill got the ideas of corporate poverty and lack of personal leadership and having the least organization possible to carry the message. The second was Mary Baker Eddy's. She was the founder of the Christian Science movement. To give proper credit to others, she didn't. In her movement, she took all the credit for everything. And so Bill made it very important in his life to give credit to other people. But he got a lot of these ideas from other people and books, and as well as from AA experiences. This book, called This Believing World, is basically a book about comparative religions. It's about most of the religions of the world. And Nell Wing, Bill's secretary, also said there in red, I believe Bill attained a remarkable perception of possible future problems from groups of our kind, where it clearly shows that the major failures of religions and cults in the past have been due to four things: too much organization, politics, money, or power. And when Bill read this book, he would read about these different religions and organizations and why they failed. And he didn't want AA to fail. And of course, in the foreword to the first edition, there are parts of the traditions already included in that. When writing or speaking publicly, to omit their personal name, to ask the press about anonymity. We're not an organization in the conventional sense, no dues or fees. The only requirement for membership is a desire to stop drinking. And these parts of the traditions were already in the foreword to the first edition of the Big Book. When it comes to group autonomy, it was done. It was a done deal. As one of the people who helped start this movement, Bill says, I thought for a long time that I ought to be able to manage it from New York, but I soon found that I could do no such thing. Neither could anybody else at AA headquarters. The groups said to us, we like what you're doing. Sometimes your suggestions and advice are good, but whether to take you or leave you alone is going to be our decision. Out in the groups, we're going to run our own show. We are not going to have a personal government in New York or anywhere else. Services, yes, but government, no. That's from Alcoholics Anonymous Comes of Age. Two people that disagreed strongly with Bill were both his good friends, Father Ed Dowling and Dr. Harry Tebow, the psychiatrist. And Bill was often just had a very easygoing attitude. These guys thought there was immaturity and a lack of responsibility, and the traditions, this group autonomy was promoting anarchy and a dilution of the program. They criticized him a lot. What do you mean you're going to let the groups run the thing themselves? You know, that's not going to work. Anyway, Bill said, almost anarchistic, a structure that actually invites deviation, knowing in advance it will fail because we have the coercives of continuous drunkenness, insanity, and death, because the penalty for enough deviation is drunkenness, and the penalty for drunkenness is insanity or death. We think this is sufficient. Bill believed that autonomy and the traditions and the problems in AA were self-correcting. They would just correct themselves. Here's an example. To me, some of the things that Nell was writing this, said to me, some of the things that stand out were letters individuals in far distant places would contact members who kept writing back and forth to the office. And with the help of the book, they were able to reach sobriety by themselves, even to start their own groups. So they'd send out a book to some guy, and he'd start a group, and they just get going. Well, and Nell says in this letter to Bill, she says, to keep us humble and laughing, there were developments like the Southern group. There was a Southern group. It was in Charleston, West Virginia, I believe. And they started through mail. And anyway, this guy wrote the glowing report about his group and its amazing recoveries of members in his group. So this group started. One of our traveling members stopped in for a visit, and his letter to us was an eye-opener indeed. It seemed that particular group was based on the theory that all alcoholic beverages were very bad for the alcoholic, except beer. The idea was carried out so thoroughly that beer was served at their AA meetings with copious readings of the AA Big Book. So there was this group, and not the only one, and they decided that they could drink beer at their meetings. Well, the beer soon cured that, and that group fell apart. But about a year later, it started again with no beer. In fact, our tradition carries the principle of independence for the individual to such an apparently fantastic length that so long as there is this is what Bill said, so long as there is the slightest interest in sobriety, the most unmoral, the most antisocial, the most critical alcoholic may gather about him a few kindred spirits and announce to us that a new Alcoholics Anonymous group has been formed. Anti-God, anti-medicine, anti-our recovery program, even anti-each other. These rampant individuals are still an AA group if they think so. Autonomy. Bill also said, while AA has restored thousands of poor Christians to their churches and has made believers out of atheists and agnostics, it's also made good AAs out of those belonging to the Buddhist, Islamic, and Jewish faiths. For example, we question very much whether our Buddhist members in Japan would have ever joined our society if AA officially stamped itself a strictly Christian movement. And then there were an awful lot of atheists in the 1940s, and they stayed sober. And there was Sergeant Bill, they called him, William Swegan, and he got sober, and he helped get groups going, but he was an atheist. He explains how some early AAs like himself in the 40s and 50s successfully worked the steps from the standpoint of a truly dedicated ethical humanism. Came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. Bill Swegan's higher power here is the laws of nature, the healing forces within nature, which can return our minds to sanity and reason, and the very rationalistic idea that the power of truth and honesty can give us the power of understanding other people with more compassion. So there were a lot of that. There were a lot of different people. And so Bill wanted to write something for them. And we found that the principles of tolerance and love had to be emphasized in actual practice. We can never say or insinuate to anyone that he must agree to our formula or be excommunicated. The atheist may stand up in AA meetings still denying the deity, yet reporting how vastly he has been changed in attitude and outlook. Much experience tells us he'll presently change his mind about God, but nobody tells him he must do so. In order to carry the principles of inclusiveness and tolerance still further, we make no religious requirement of anyone. All people having an alcoholic problem who wish to get rid of it and so make a happy adjustment with the circumstances of their lives become AA members by simply associating with us. Nothing but sincerity is needed, but we do not demand even this. In such an atmosphere, the orthodox, the unorthodox, and the believer mix happily and usefully together, An opportunity for spiritual growth is open to all. Bill Wilson, in February 1948 Grapevine on Tradition 3, wrote about the alcoholic. He said, if he's anything, the sick alcoholic is a rebellious nonconformist. Who, me? Yeah, a rebellious nonconformist, even after we're sober. How well we understand that every member of A.A. was once a rebel himself. Hence, we cannot offer to meet him at any halfway mark. We must enter the dark cave where he is and show him that we understand. We realize that he's altogether too weak and confused to jump hurdles. If we raise obstacles, he might stay away and perish. He might be denied his priceless opportunity. So when the newcomer asks, are there any conditions? We joyfully reply, no, not one. When skeptically he comes back saying, but certainly there must be things that I have to do and believe. We quickly answer, in Alcoholics Anonymous, there are no musts. On anonymity, some people, there's some pictures from a Dayton, Ohio newspaper, they look like the Lone Ranger to me, but in some sections of AA, anonymity is carried to the point of real absurdity. Members are on such poor basis of communication, they don't each know each other's last names or where each lives. It's like the cell of an underground. That's why when I'm in an AA meeting like this, I always introduce myself as Jim Worley from Cancun. I'm not anonymous inside of AA. If I speak publicly, then I'm Jim W. But here in AA, I'm Jim Worley. Then he goes on, and Bill says, in other sections, we see the reverse. Sometimes it's difficult to restrain AAs from shouting too much before the entire public. But eventually things work out. And the super anonymous people are apt to come out of hiding, respecting their friends and business associates. And I think the long-time trend is toward the middle of the road, which is probably where we should be. Now, the thing that concerns us most in Alcoholics Anonymous is what of our future? What about our permanent unity? For unless we have unity permanently, there will be little recovery. Now, as you have gathered, you friends of ours, alcoholics are really very explosive material, and they still are even sober. Boy, ain't that the truth. We can still argue and get mad. We are not saints in Alcoholics Anonymous today. We have our group troubles. We have the panhandlers. We have dictators. We have people who want to try to run things. We have all sorts of difficulties. Little Red Riding Hood and the big bad wolf. And then we have the Pharisees who throw stones at them. We are just human beings trying to get along. So I don't think we're going to fall apart. Nevertheless, some friends of mine asked if I wouldn't try to state in a tentative way what principles have evolved from this process of living and working together in groups for the last few years. And a year ago, I tried to do that. I published in the Grapevine. So he started publishing in 1945 about the traditions. The last paragraph there says, these principles, Bill says, are no dictate of mine. I've been merely the mirror which has tried to reflect what seemed to me the group opinion about these matters, sharing our experience. In the early days, even Bill was opposed to organization. Rules. Bill said, were we to proceed by rules, somebody would have to make the rules. More difficult still, somebody would have to enforce them. Rule making has often been tried. Usually results in controversy among the rule makers as to what the rules should be. When it comes to enforcing an edict, well, we all know the answer to that. When we try to enforce rules and regulations, however reasonable, we almost always get in so much trouble that our authority disappears. Down with the dictators, off with their heads. Hurt and astonished, control committee after control committee, leader after leader makes the discovery that human authority, be it ever so impartial and benign, seldom works long or well in our affairs. Alcoholics are yet the most rugged of individuals, true anarchists at heart. When therefore we A.A.s look to the future, we must always be asking ourselves if the spirit which now binds us together in our common cause will always be stronger than those personal ambitions and desires which tend to drive us apart. So we're going to talk now a little bit about the process of the traditions, how they came about and planted and grew and were harvested. This is how they started out. They started out as scribbles on scrap paper. You know, this is some of Bill's writing, and he would write something and then he'd cross it off and he'd say, no, I don't like that. And an AA group is a spiritual entity having but what? No, I don't like that. And he would cross off and change. And his sister, his half sister, Helen Evans, remembers. She says, in addition to her, in her addition to her grapevine chores, she likes remembering the typing she did for Bill. He was beginning to think about those ideas that later became the traditions, she said, and he had a one-track mind. Whenever he was figuring out something like that for AA, he simply could not put his mind on anything else. Many times at dinner at Stepping Stones, Lois and I would look at each other and start to giggle because he'd picked up a fork to eat the soup or something. Most of the time, he liked to dictate lying on the floor at the head of the stairwell in Bedford Hills at that house you see, with his arms folded behind his head. His sister says, I typed those traditions over and over and over. He would think 2 or 3 of them were pretty good, but then he'd share them with other AAs. The house was always full of people. Weekends, 30 or 40 would drop in and Bill would read them what he had done and the discussion would start. Next day, we would tear up what we had done and start all over again. The Grapevine was incorporated and Bill wrote a lot in the Grapevine. Of course, we mentioned he started writing the 12 suggested points for AA tradition. The first reception of the traditions was interesting and amusing. The reaction was mixed, to say the least. Most people liked the traditions for other groups, but not for their own. He says in the second part there, he says, I began to travel and talk about the new traditions. Down there at the end, he says, Bill, we'd love to have you come and speak. Do tell us where you used to hide your bottles and all about that big hot flash spiritual experience of yours. But for heaven's sakes, please don't talk anymore about those damn traditions. So the traditions were not easily accepted. The traditions are stated in positive language. He says, I offer these suggestions neither as one man's dictum nor as a creed of any kind. He says there were years when we were growing up in adolescence, and before we leave, this is a picture of Earl Treat. His story is in the English version of the Big Book. And Earl was visiting Bill one time, and he says, Bill, don't you get it through your thick head that these drunks do not like to read. They'll listen for a while, they will not read anything. Now you want to capsule these traditions as simply as are the 12 steps to recovery. So he says, we need to shorten them. And so he and I started the capsulation process, which lasted a day or two. So there weren't the little short versions in the beginning, but they sat down and wrote them. And then he sent a handwritten note to Dr. Bob and about what do you think about these traditions and these short forms of traditions. And this is one of the earliest versions. The common welfare should come first, individual desires afterwards. Everything in yellow there eventually was changed from one of these first versions of the traditions. And we don't have time to go through all of them. So the 12 traditions were approved in 1950 at the convention held in Cleveland, Ohio, with about 3,000 attendees. There was a traditions meetings. And Bill got up, and different people talked about different traditions. And then Bill got up and he didn't read the traditions. He paraphrased. He said, well, this is what they're about. And he said, so summing up, I then inquired, he just summed it up, if those present had any objections to the 12 traditions as they stood. So who's going to argue with Bill? You know, he's up there and says, hey, here's what they are. Hearing no objections, I offered our traditions, impressively unanimous. The crowd stood up. So ended the fine hour in which we took our destiny by the hand. But what he said and what was approved wasn't the short version of the traditions. It didn't even include a couple of the traditions. So, but Bill was very informal about these things. Now, after the traditions were adopted in 1950, people wanted a book, and we need to put them in a book. And so Bill started writing at Stepping Stones, his home, in this little cinder block house that he built. He, not by himself, but he helped build it, and up on a hill outside of the house. And this was his office, where he wrote the 12 traditions and the steps that are in the 12 traditions. And if you ever happen to get to New York, please visit Bill's home there, and you can visit and sit at the desk where he wrote the 12 traditions and the 12 steps there in his office. So the writing, editing, and approval of the 12 and 12. Here's a letter that he sent out to everybody, just like he had done with the big book. He had a rough draft, a manuscript, and he sent it out. And he says, attached, you'll find this manuscript. And so please let me know if you have any changes or corrections that you want made. So he sent it out. On the left there is one of the pages, and yeah, there were some corrections. In the original, he says on the first step, an obsession for destructive drinking, only God can remove. Well, what was approved, well, it was only an act of providence can remove it from us. And there's part of a sentence, our humiliation is absolute. That was omitted completely. And there were a lot of other changes made in that, in the rough draft. Not serious changes, but, you know, a couple paragraphs were deleted from the 9th step. So the interest in there was the book. Bill made an arrangement with Harper and Brothers. So besides A.A. printing it, he also gave it to a printing company called Harper and Brothers, and they also did it. Something else important to remember, because there are a lot of people who don't like the 12 and 12, and Bill always considered it a textbook, just like the big book. In Alcoholics Anonymous Comes of Age, in a couple places, he calls it a textbook that explains AA's 24 basic principles and their application. This is Tom Powers. He's another one of the people that helped edit the 12 and 12, as well as the second edition of the big book. Another person who helped edit was Father John Ford, a Jesuit, just like Father Ed Dowling. Father Ed helped with the editing too, but by the time it was ready to be printed, he was almost blind and not doing well. So Father John Ford helped, and also Jack Alexander, who wrote the Saturday Evening Post article. He helped to do the editing, and a lady by the name of Betty Love. At the Second General Conference in 1952, he told people that he was going to be writing. And I going to go a little fast here. I'm running out of time, but he told people that he was going to be writing it, and he did. He had been writing, he wrote for about 18 months, which is pretty much the same period as it took him to write the big book. So after 18 months of writing and editing, the book was finally released in 1953. They put out an announcement to all the groups, and it's step by step, tradition by tradition. In nearly 200 deeply stirring pages, Bill offers his unique insight into the full meaning of each of A.A.'s tested guideposts. An announcement made to all the groups. This is just a picture. The 1953 conference is just so important that although I have to do it quickly, I want to mention it. This was after he had the 12 and 12 had been published. There's a picture, a little blurry, of him at that 1953 conference. Built at the conference where he introduced the second edition of the big book. No, that was in 55, sorry. Where he introduced the 12 and 12. You know, you would think, okay, this is Bill talking in the 12 and 12. So this is it. Well, at the same time as he did that, he also talked about different variations in the steps throughout the years and during the current times. He says there's always a tendency in AA in every society so that the society becomes hardened in its principles, and you must conform or you can't be a member. Bill was still worried that things would become dogmatic, and he didn't want even this new book to be dogma. He talked about at this, where he presented his AA's 12 and 12. He talked about, oh, there are these people in Sweden, and they only have 7 steps, and that's okay. You know, they'll eventually, work around to maybe having 12, but right now they only have 12 steps. And then there's a group of the seamen in sailors in New York, and they were afraid of being God-bitten. So they wanted something psychiatric. So they came up with they had only 5 steps in their group. And he said, well, it's all right. They eventually will work it out. And very importantly, Bill said, where variations of the traditions are concerned, we've gone up and down like a window shade. We even have a tradition that guarantees the right of any group to vary all of them if they want to. Let's remember, we're talking about suggested steps and traditions. When we say each group is autonomous, that means in effect that it has a right to be wrong from the viewpoint of the rest of you. My feeling is that the more we insist on strict conformity with these steps and traditions, the more resistance against them we create. But if these steps and traditions do reflect accurately what our experience is, the alcoholic, no matter whether he be Swedish, Hindu, Chinese, or what, will eventually adopt the principles that produce the best result for him and his group. So it was published. The corporate name was Works Publishing, had been changed to Alcoholics Anonymous Publishing. And but that didn't stop people. Ed Webster, who wrote the Little Red Book in 1955, even after Bill had put out his book, put out another book called Stools and Bottles, which is a great little book. I still use it sometimes with sponsees, especially it's about the first 4 steps, and particularly the inventory. So it didn't stop, but the 12 traditions of Alcoholics Anonymous are our experience of living and working together, Bill said. Very quickly, I'm going to do some of the General Service Conference for the U.S. and Canada. Starting as early as 1984, and in recent years, some members and friends of AA have asked if it would be wise to update the language, idioms, and historical references to present a more contemporary image for the fellowship. There were words and things that were not modern. However, 1984 and even up to 2002, because the book has helped so many alcoholics find recovery, there's a strong sentiment. It was unanimously recommended that the text in the book 12 and 12, written by Bill, remain as it is, recognizing the fellowships. And this is just A.A.'s tradition. We just don't change anything that Bill wrote. And that was up until 2002. Now a big however. However, with a focus on inclusivity, the 2021 General Service Conference updated and footnoted some of the original language for clarity. So these were wording changes that were made in the 12 and 12 in the GSO, US and Canada. So if you have new 12 and 12 books, they will say reformatted and footnoted June 2021 in accordance with advisory actions of the 71st General Service Conference. And, although we think Bill's writing should remain because of inclusivity, we are making these changes. So in 2021, the General Service Conference recommended a revision be made to page 116 in the book 12 Steps and 12 Traditions, replacing the phrase opposite sex with the word partner. So in yellow there it says, on text page 117, currently used to read, nearly every sound human being experiences at some time in life a compelling desire to find a mate of the opposite sex with whom a fully possible union can be made. That was changed. It now reads, nearly every sound human being experiences at some time in life a compelling desire to find a partner with whom the fullest possible union can be made. And then the second change was a sentence which includes the phrase lustful enough to rape. In paragraph on page 66 in chapter 6 be revised to refer to the sins without specific mention of examples like rape. They did not want to mention that. So on page 66, which currently reads, no one wants to be angry enough to murder, lustful enough to rape, glutton enough to ruin him. It now reads, here we go. Here's an actual copy of the page. No one wants to commit the deadly sins of anger, lust, or gluttony. And then there's an asterisk there. And the asterisk refers you to the bottom of the page where it says this sentence has been updated. And then the other one is nearly every sound human being experiences at some time in life a compelling desire to find a partner with whom the fullest possible union can be made. And again, at the bottom, the asterisk, this sentence has been updated from the original text to reflect the inclusivity of fellowship for gay people particularly. We are yet in an era of change, Bill says. Our 12 steps probably won't change, and traditions not at all likely. But our manner of communications, our manner of organizing ourselves for function or service, let us hope that this goes on changing for the better forever. There's a very natural resistance we have toward change. We are apt to say, well, it worked very well the way it was, so why change? But after all, we've undertaken several tremendous changes. In the beginning, people said, we don't even need a book, like the big book. And but we ought to stay in yellow there. It says we ought to stay open-minded on this matter of change. We reverence the past and its lessons for so long as those teachers work. When they don't, we readapt and we reshape. That has been our history. We found that the principles The principles of tolerance and love had to be emphasized in actual practice. We can never say or insinuate to anyone that he must agree to our formula or be excommunicated. There in the second one, it says, in order to carry the principles of inclusiveness and tolerance still further, we make no religious requirement of anyone. This is the crossroads at which we in AA stand. This is a good time to re-examine, this is Bill talking, how well we have looked upon our AA history and how much we have profited by it. What false insights or false glories we may have been extracting from history to our future detriment. It is a moment to examine the purpose of this society. Indeed, we are very lucky to be able to state as the nucleus of that purpose a single word, sobriety. Sometimes we begin to think that perhaps, according to scriptural promise, the first shall be last, and the last, meaning us, shall really be first. That would indeed be a very dangerous presumption, and never should we indulge it. If we do, we shall compete in history with other societies who have been ill-advised enough to suppose that they had a monopoly on truth or in some way superior to other attempts. I thank you for your attention. I hope you've enjoyed it. And now, if anyone has any questions, I will be happy to answer them.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you.
Alan, free അല്ലേ Alan?
Free അല്ല, ഒരു മിനിറ്റ്. ഞാൻ ജോലിയിലാണ്. Okay. I would like to extend our sincere gratitude to Mr. Jim Worley from Cancun, Mexico. It was a tough topic, and you have a good slideshow. I know you did a wonderful job. It looked like everyone can understand easily. Yeah, it's like a multimedia. You did a good job.
Thank
And
you.
if anyone have any doubts or anything needs to be cleared out, please raise your hands and you can talk. We have 2-3 minutes now, and I think it's everyone clear about the topic. So thank you, Jim, again from Midnight Star Group, and we will see you next time. Thank you so much for your time, and